Born in 1947, Peggy Carr's life was never easy. With deaf and impoverished parents, she had to start working early to provide for her family. Limited by her minimal education, Peggy struggled to find decent jobs. The positions available to her were either poorly paid or hazardous, such as waitressing at remote truck stops. Despite these challenges, Peggy remained determined and optimistic. Her tough demeanor helped her handle job-related dangers, including harassment from drunk men at lonely locations. Her hardened exterior made it difficult to find a romantic partner for many years, but eventually, an unknown man captured her heart, leading to their marriage. Over the next couple of years, Peggy and her husband would have 3 children, Yelena, Alan, and Dwayne. The couple worked hard to provide for their family, and it seemed things were finally going right for Peggy. But soon, Peggy started to have issues with her husband, and before long the marriage would come crashing down. By the mid-1980s, Peggy was in her mid-30s, a single mother working on jobs to raise 3 children. Although she tried to keep a positive attitude at work, Peggy grew increasingly sad and lonely. Life had been hard on her, and it just didn't seem like things would ever get better. As her kids grew up, they started to notice how sad and lonely their mother was, and they wished she would meet someone, fall in love, and be happy again. By late 1987, her children's wish came true. Peggy met a man named Perlin Carr, whom everyone called Pi. Pi, like Peggy, had recently divorced his wife. He also had 2 teenage children, and he worked at a local phosphate mining company in Albuquerque, Florida. Peggy and Pi hit it off when they met, mainly because they were both strict people who did not condone nonsense from others. When Peggy and Pi started dating, Peggy's children noticed a significant improvement in her mood. She was happier, lighter on her feet, and more relaxed. By April 1988, Peggy and Pi delighted their children with the news that they were getting married. Peggy and her 3 kids moved into Pi's home in Albuquerque, Florida after the wedding. Although Pi's home was small and 4 new people made it even tighter, the blended family seemed to work out well. The family had 2 big dogs, 5 children, got along well, and they were just happy to see their parents. But just a few months after they got married, Peggy and Pi began to have some marital issues. On top of their issues, Peggy had begun hearing rumors that Pi was still seeing his ex-wife, so they grew increasingly distant from each other. Around the time that Peggy and Pi's issues started, their 2 dogs suddenly became violently ill. They were howling in pain, losing weight rapidly, and their fur started falling out. It seemed like the dogs may have come down with a strange disease, or they might have ingested a poison. Before long, both dogs passed away, further plunging the Carr household into a gloomy atmosphere. Peggy and Pi continued to have daily issues that drove them further apart. In early October 1988, Peggy and her children had to move out of Pi's house for a week to stay at a motel because Peggy and Pi's fights had reached a point where they couldn't stand each other. The children also began taking sides with their respective parents. So the once happy family was now being torn apart. Discover the chilling world of secret crime mysteries, where we delve into the most perplexing cold cases and unsolved crimes. Join us as we unravel hidden clues and explore haunting mysteries. Subscribe now and be part of the journey to bring these cases to light. On October 23, 1988, Pi decided that he wanted to go on an unplanned hunting trip to get away for the day. Peggy and her kids had returned to the home by this time, so Peggy could be with the kids while Pi went on his trip. Once Pi left, Peggy and her daughter, Delina, prepared to go to work. They were both waitresses at a local diner, and they had morning shifts on that particular day. As Peggy waited tables and attended to customers, she suddenly began to feel her heart racing erratically. That morning, Peggy was not doing any heavy lifting or stressful work. The only things she was carrying were the trays holding customers' orders. Peggy thought she should just take it easy and her heart would stop beating so fast. And before long, she started to feel this tingling sensation in her arms and legs, and her palms started to sweat. It suddenly occurred to Peggy that she might be having a heart attack. But rather than panicking or becoming hysterical, Peggy tried to calm herself down. She went to the staff restroom and washed her face and hands, then slipped into the staff break room to relax for a bit. As she was relaxing, Yelena noticed that her mother had gone into the break room, so she went to check on her. Peggy calmly said she felt she might be having a heart attack and that she would go home and wait it out. Yelena was immediately alarmed at the idea that her mother could be having a heart attack, but she was not surprised at Peggy's calm demeanor. She knew Peggy was not fond of raising false alarms or panicking unnecessarily, so she believed if Peggy said she would sleep off a heart attack, then there wasn't anything to worry about, but she did make her mother promise that if she started feeling worse, then she would go to the hospital. Peggy informed the manager that she would be taking the rest of the day off because of how she was feeling, and Yelena promised to check up on her as soon as she finished her shift. When Peggy got home, she found the house empty. The kids were still at school and Pi was still away on his trip, so she went to her bedroom to lie down. After a few hours, Peggy's 17-year-old son, Dwayne, returned from school to find his mother lying in bed. The sight of Peggy taking a nap in the middle of the day was so strange to Dwayne that he immediately knew something was wrong. Peggy never took naps, not even when she was ill. With concern written all over his face, Dwayne asked Peggy if she was all right, and Peggy said she was. But just as he turned to leave the bedroom, Peggy suddenly blurted out she was not fine and felt horrible. She said that it felt like fire was being pumped through her arms and legs, and the pain was so blinding that she could barely even speak. At this, Dwayne's suspicions were confirmed. His mother was not a dramatic person, so if she said this was the most painful thing she had ever felt, Dwayne knew she had to get to the hospital immediately. Luckily, Pi returned home from his hunting trip just then, and Dwayne immediately told him that they had to take Peggy to the hospital immediately. But to his shock, Pi merely waved him off, saying that he was sure that Peggy was just suffering from the flu, and she would be fine in a day or two. Dwayne immediately called his sister and asked her to return home so she could take Peggy to the hospital, since Pi was not planning on doing so himself. When Yelena arrived at the house, Dwayne had to carry Peggy to the car because her condition had gotten so bad that she could not even walk or stand. When they got to the hospital, Peggy was wheeled into the intensive care unit to begin receiving treatment. And this was where the real problem began, because neither Dwayne nor Yelena had any idea about what might have caused Peggy to feel the way she was. By now, Peggy could only lie down, moaning in pain. Her heart was still racing, her limbs still felt like they were on fire, and she was now nauseous and vomiting. The doctors ran a number of tests on Peggy, trying to determine what was wrong with her, but all the tests were turned negative or showed nothing was wrong with her. This seriously baffled the doctors. Peggy was writhing in pain, and it seemed like her ailment came out of nowhere because they could not find anything wrong with her from the tests they had run. With no better alternative, the doctor decided to keep her in the hospital and observe her. After about 3 days of being in the hospital, Peggy's symptoms seemed to improve. Although she felt bouts of extreme pain in her limbs and her heart was still racing occasionally, she could now talk, eat, and move around a bit. Since she seemed to be on the mend, the doctors decided to discharge her so she could fully recuperate at home. When Peggy got home on October 26, 1988, she lay in bed to recover and she felt herself improving. But within 24 hours, all the symptoms were back again. Much stronger this time. Her arms and legs felt like they were on fire. Her heart was racing. She was nauseous, and she had lost so much weight that she looked like a shadow of herself. But rather than go to the hospital, Peggy's family knew that even the doctors had no idea what was wrong with her, so they thought it might be better for her to stay home. But right before their eyes, it seemed like Peggy was coming apart at the seams. She couldn't walk, talk, eat, or even sleep. She could only lay in bed writhing in pain, and occasionally screaming into her pillow because of the intense pain she was feeling. Finally, on October 30th, her family relented and decided to take her to the hospital again. When Peggy arrived at the hospital, the doctors remembered her from the previous week and also remembered that they had been unable to determine the cause of her symptoms. But just to be sure they were leaving no stone unturned, the doctors decided to run another batch of tests on Peggy to see if they could find something they had earlier missed. They tested for food poisoning, thinking Peggy had ingested something tearing up her insides, and they tested for all the common diseases that might affect a 41-year-old woman, but the test results again showed nothing was wrong with Peggy. Once again, the doctors had no better alternative than to put Peggy in a room and observe her. As Peggy lay in her room, other patients and hospital staff could hear her screams of pure agony echo through the hospital halls. Peggy had begun slipping in and out of consciousness, but the situation was about to get even worse. Peggy's son, Dwayne, and Pi's son, 16-year-old Travis, were rushed into the same hospital that Peggy was at. They had suddenly began suffering the same symptoms that Peggy had been suffering for over a week. Like Peggy, the doctors ran several tests on Dwayne and Travis to determine what was wrong with them, but they also came up with nothing. But suddenly, Dr. Robert Van Hook, one of the neurologists working on Peggy, noticed something about their symptoms that immediately stood out to him. Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis were losing their hair, and combined with the other symptoms they were feeling, the neurologist had a hunch that he knew the exact cause of their illness. But first he sent for a very specific test kit to confirm his suspicions. When the test kit arrived and the neurologist tested Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis, the test results were positive. All three had ingested a rare and expensive chemical called thallium-1 nitrate. Thallium-1 nitrate is a tasteless, colorless, odorless metal that was once used in rat poison, but was banned because of how toxic it was to humans. The average human has a small quantity of thallium in their system, but even the slightest increase in that naturally occurring amount can have fatal consequences, with symptoms like severe pain in the hands and legs, nausea, hair loss, weight loss, and erratic heartbeat. Peggy had 50,000 times the naturally occurring amount of thallium in her body, while Dwayne and Travis each had about 20,000 times that amount. Doctors decided to test the rest of the family, and they all had elevated levels of thallium in their system, though not as much as that of Peggy, Dwayne, and Travis. Before the test results, the doctors had not previously considered that Peggy and her son's cases were a potential crime. But with the test results showing that Peggy and her family may have been poisoned, they began to see the case in a new light. The hospital contacted the Polk County Sheriff's Office to let them know about the case and the fact that there was a potential crime at play there. Nobody knew where Peggy and her boys had come into contact with such a rare and expensive chemical. Was it accidental or were they deliberately poisoned? While the police began their investigation, things looked grim for Peggy. Although there was a cure for thallium poisoning, Peggy's body had been so completely ravaged by the poison that even if treatment had been administered, she would not likely survive. Doctors told her that the only thing they could do was to make her as comfortable as possible while they waited for the poison to take her life. But there was hope for the boys. They could begin receiving treatment, and everyone hoped it would be fast enough to save their lives. A few days after Peggy received the news that she could not be saved, she slipped into a coma. She would remain in the coma for the next 4 months until March 3, 1989, when her family decided to take her off life support. After spending 2 months in the hospital, Dwayne made a full recovery. Travis would remain hospitalized for 6 months before eventually recovering from the poisoning. But tragically, he could never walk again because of the extreme damage the poison had caused to his limbs. For Sheriff Judd from the Polk County Sheriff's Office, Peggy and her son's case was very delicate regardless of whether they were intentionally poisoned. If someone had poisoned them, they had a murder and several attempted murders on their hands, and a killer at large. If they had ingested the poison by accident, then there was the likelihood that the source of the poison was still out there for other altruist residents to ingest. Either way, the stakes were high, so Sheriff Judd was determined to get to the bottom of it. Investigators tested every single item and surface in the car house for thallium, but all the results came back negative. Meanwhile, as news got out that the Carr family had been poisoned and the police did not know where the poison came from, panic began to spread throughout Alturas. People were afraid that the poison might have come from their groundwater or that they could even already be dying and not know about it. So investigators examined the Carr's well water, which was connected to at least 2 other houses, but they found nothing. Also, no one else in the community had come down with the symptoms that Peggy and her son suffered. At this point, Prosecutor John Aguero from the Florida State's Attorney's Office joined the investigation and started to look into pesticides, insecticides, or any other plant spray where thallium might have come from. Alturas had many orange groves, and there might have been thallium in the chemicals used to preserve the trees. But the test results all came back negative. While scouring the Carr house to find what Peggy and her sons could have eaten or drank that could have contained the poison, police discovered their first break in the case: an 8-pack of Coca-Cola bottles with lids that had been tampered with. They immediately sent the bottles for testing, and when the results came back, It showed that the Coca-Cola bottles had high levels of thallium. Someone had put thallium inside the drinks and then replaced the covers. The first obvious lead was that this had become a case of product tampering from the bottling company's end. If it was, there could be a national thallium poisoning crisis because practically everyone drank Coca-Cola. When Albuquerque's residents heard about this new lead, many became scared of drinking Coke. However, as the investigation proceeded, it came out that the poisoning did not come from the bottling company or the stores that sold Coca-Cola and Albuquerque's. This led investigators to one chilling conclusion. The bottles had been tampered with, but it had been done by someone who deliberately targeted the Carr family. The prime suspect was Pi Carr himself. On October 23rd, the day Peggy had begun experiencing the symptoms, Pi had suddenly decided to go on a hunting trip that kept him away for most of the day. Investigators believe this might have been the way of trying to cover his tracks. There was also the fact that Pi worked at a phosphate mining company, so he could have access to a chemical as expensive and rare as thallium. Coupled with the fact that Peggy and Pi had begun having marital issues, it seemed very possible that Pi was the one who poisoned Peggy. However, this theory had some loopholes. Pi and his children had also tested positive for thallium poisoning, meaning they drank from the Coke that Peggy and her children drank. So if Pi truly wanted Peggy dead, it seemed more realistic that he would have planned it in such a way that she was the only one who ingested the poison. Or at least he would have made sure that his children did not ingest it. Still, police brought Pi in for questioning. Pi told them that he knew nothing about how the poison got into his home, swearing that the hunting trip was coincidental. As he was talking, he mentioned something offhandedly that did not seem like a big deal then. But when police followed up on Pi's tip, they would find the next big clue to help them piece this puzzling case together and discover who had poisoned Peggy and her family. As Pi sat in the interrogation room trying to defend himself, he suddenly remembered something that happened a few weeks before Peggy fell ill. Peggy's son, Dwayne, had gone to check the mail one day when he found a printed note addressed to Pi. The note read, "Have exactly 2 weeks to move out of the state of Florida or you will all die. This is no joke." At the time, Peggy and Pi dismissed the death threat as a prank by some mischievous teenagers. But now that the entire family had been poisoned, it seemed that the note might not have been a joke. It might have been from the person who poisoned the cards. As police began investigating the note, they noticed a few things that immediately told them that whoever had sent the note knew Pi and his family well. For example, the sender had spelled Pi's name correctly as Pye rather than Pie, as most people would spell it. Armed with this new lead, police began interviewing hundreds of Albuquerque's residents trying to find out who might have had a reason to hate the Carrs and want them dead. But in a small and closely knit community like Albuquerque's, neighbors looked out for each other. Police could not find a single person with a motive to hurt the Carrs, so they decided to ask FBI Special Agent Mark Young, a profiler with hundreds of cases under his belt, to help build a profile of the likely perpetrator of this crime. Agent Young believed that a person using poison to kill was likely someone who had been wrong and wanted to correct the wrong they believed had been done to them. Also, the specific type of thallium used to poison the Coca-Cola bottles was the unnoticeable type. It was expensive, not something you could pop into the store and buy. This showed that the perpetrator was intelligent, with a significant knowledge of chemistry. With this in mind, investigators ruled out suspects until they reached the Carrs' neighbors, George Trepal and his wife Diana Carr. George Trepal was born on January 23, 1949. He was a chemist and computer programmer with multiple degrees. His wife Diana Carr, who had no relationship with Picker, was a successful orthopedic surgeon with a private practice in Albuquerque. While Diana had a very strong personality and was more outgoing, she was a very good George was a quiet man who barely left the house. But he wasn't always so laid back. In the 1970s, when George was a student at Clemson University, South Carolina, he was fond of doing drugs and was always willing to share his substances with others, with or without their consent. George and his friends formed a habit of picking up hitchhikers and giving them drug-laced brownies or cookies just to see how they would react. In 1975, he got sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for running a large methamphetamine or meth lab. An interesting thing about George's meth cooking process was that one of the byproducts was thallium. George also had a habit of studying police manuals. He considered himself an expert on crime scene procedures. George and Diana were not exactly the best neighbors to live with. They always had problems with Peggy and Pi and their children, from complaining that they were laughing or playing music too loud, to complaining that their dogs were Diana and George found the cars annoying and obnoxious, and although Peggy tried to be amicable, they were never on good terms. Diana especially hated the cars and would always complain about them. George, on the other hand, seemed nicer. He smiled and waved at them and did not complain as much as his wife did. But secretly, George hated the cars as much as his wife did. In March 1988, George reported Pi to the local zoning board for violating zoning laws. He had tried to convert his garage into an apartment for his stepdaughter, Yelena, and her baby girl. 2 days before Peggy fell sick, Diana stormed to the car house to complain as usual. When they told her off, she left shouting, "You won't get away with this. This isn't over." Aside from being very successful in their respective fields, George and Diana were very intelligent people, so intelligent that they were members of a prestigious organization called Mensa. Mensa was founded in 1946 by a barrister named Roland Barrel and his friend Dr. Lance Ware. It is an exclusive club for people who fall within the upper 2% of the general population in a special IQ test and are highly intelligent. To gain entry into Mensa, applicants have to pass a series of special IQ tests, and even passing those tests does not always guarantee admission into the club. When they do get admitted, members regularly hold meetings, discussion panels, debates, seminars, and other hangouts to share ideas and engage in stimulating conversation. Although Mensa was originally based in England, it has branches worldwide. The Florida chapter of Mensa, to which George and Diana belong, regularly held monthly fun, mentally stimulating meetings called Murder Mystery Weekend. Members would take turns planning a crime mystery that the rest of the members would try to solve for an entire weekend. For that weekend, all the members would go to a secluded location, like an inn or hotel, where they would stay and play their parts in solving the murder mystery. In April 1989, a few weeks after Peggy's death, the Mensa Florida chapter welcomed a new member, a middle-aged woman named Sherry Gwen. Sherry had moved to Florida after escaping an abusive marriage in Texas. Once she joined Mensa, she found a sense of community and immediately became close with George and Diana. The month that Sherry joined Mensa was George and Diana's turn to plan the murder mystery that would be solved for that month's murder mystery weekend. George, now 40 years old, took this role very seriously, and he spent weeks trying to create the perfect crime. Their murder mystery weekend was very successful, as all the members had a hard time trying to solve the crime and identify the murder weapon. But when George finally disclosed the murder weapon to the group, Sherry became fascinated. She would spend hours talking to George about it, trying to learn everything he knew about the murder weapon and how it would play out if it were used in real life. George, who was often overshadowed by his wife, was flattered with the attention he received from Sherry, and he was happy to answer all her questions. In December 1989, Diana moved her medical practice from Alturas to a neighboring town called Sebring, so she and George decided to move there too. When Sherry heard about it, she immediately asked if she could rent their house since they weren't selling it yet. As soon as Sherry moved into the house, almost the entire Alturas police department descended upon the house. Sherry Gwen was not in fact a divorced woman but fled Texas after escaping an abusive marriage. Her real name was Susan Gorek, and she was an undercover policewoman assigned to investigate George Trepal and Diana Carr. During their initial investigation, police interviewed George. Although he seemed meek and reserved, when asked if he knew anybody who would want to hurt the Carrs, he said, "Someone must have wanted them to move out of the neighborhood." This statement echoed the death threat Pi had received weeks before Peggy fell ill. When police discovered the altercations between the Trepals and Carrs, their suspicion of George grew. Additionally, he fit the FBI profile for the perpetrator, a white, extremely intelligent male with a passive personality who avoided conflict. So, Susan Gorek had been assigned to investigate them on her cover. When Susan discovered that the murder weapon George used to plan his murder mystery was thallium poisoning, she knew George was most likely the killer. Also, the pamphlet he printed describing the murder in this mystery read, "When a death threat appears on the doorstep, prudent people throw out all their food and watch what they eat. Hardly anyone dies from magic. Most items on the doorstep are just a neighbor's way of saying, "I don't like you. Move or else." So as soon as he and Diana left their house, she called for backup and ordered a search of the house. In the garage, the police found a treasure trove of chemicals, including thallium. They also discovered that George often brewed his own beer, so he had machines to remove bottle covers and replace them. Investigators determined that George had finally had enough of his neighbors, so he decided to get rid of them. He fit the profile, had the means and motive to commit and had the opportunity to sneak a case of Coca-Cola into the car's kitchen. Alturas was a community where people hardly ever locked their doors, and casually strolling by to say hello to a neighbor was normal. With all this evidence, the police had enough to bring George in for questioning. When George arrived at the Alturas police station, he appeared shy and avoided eye contact with the officers interviewing him. But faced with all the evidence, he maintained that he had nothing to do with the poisoning, but investigators were not buying it. On April 5, 1990, Trepal was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted first-degree murder, 7 counts of poisoning food or water, and 1 count of tampering with a consumer product. In January 1991, George went on trial for these 15 criminal counts, including first-degree murder, 6 counts of attempted murder, poisoning food or water, and product tampering. From January 7th to February 7th, 1991, the jury returned a guilty verdict against George on all counts. He was sentenced to death. Today, George remains on death row at the Union Correctional Institution in Railford, Florida. George has filed several appeals challenging the FBI's investigation procedure and the credibility of the state's witnesses, but all his appeals have been denied. She would eventually divorce George in 1996 and were married. Peggy's children, Alan, Yelena, and Dwayne, have since moved on. Knowing the evil mastermind who killed their mother, paralyzed their stepbrother Travis, and nearly killed Dwayne, has been made to face the law. Peggy's life was very difficult for a long time, and just when things were about to start getting good for her, her life was violently snatched by a neighbor who just didn't like her and her family. At least her family can move on, knowing she got justice. But do you think Diana Carr should have also been charged with murder, or at least attempted murder? Let us know in the comments. Before we continue, 90% of you haven't subscribed to our channel, so if you like this video, please subscribe. It motivates us to make more content for you. Okay, let's continue. On July 26, 2022, 41-year-old Aftab Hussein was discovered beside his vehicle on Rhode Island Street in Albuquerque, New Mexico, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds. He succumbed to his injuries. Investigators found that his attacker had concealed themselves behind a bush near the driveway where Aftab usually parked his car. After Aftab exited his vehicle, the shooter fired multiple times from behind the bush. Aftab, originally from Pakistan, was a Muslim who worked at the popular Flying Star Cafe in Albuquerque. Tragically, just a few days later, on August 1st, another Muslim man, Mohammed Afzal Hussein, was fatally shot in a drive-by incident near the intersection of Cornell Drive and Garfield Avenue while out for an evening stroll. His brother had to identify his body and see how distorted the shooting had left Mohammed's face. Mohammed was originally from Pakistan and had studied law and human resource management at the University of Punjab before he and his brother came to the United States on student visas to attend the University of New Mexico, where he earned a bachelor's degree and a master's degree in community and regional planning. He served as the president of the Graduate and Professional Student Association while working on his master's, a position he won with 72% of the vote. According to his brother, Mohammed had the courage to speak up when others would not, which was part of what led him to wanting a leadership position. He was working towards obtaining U.S. citizenship and had hopes of a career in politics once he obtained it. At the time of his death, Mohammed was a well-respected member of the planning team for the city of Espanola. He had a 90-minute commute each way to work every day because he chose to live in the same apartment complex as his brother in Albuquerque, so that he could be a major part of his brother's children's lives. Just before he was killed, he had been given the opportunity to live in a house on a 100-acre ranch owned by the city of Espanola, and he was looking forward to this new chapter in his life. The murders of 2 Muslim men in the same city in such a short amount of time raised concerns that the 2 crimes may have been connected, and that Muslim men were being targeted by a killer. Authorities also considered the possibility that a third murder may also have been related. 62-year-old Muhammad Zahir Ahmadi was a Muslim man originally from Afghanistan. On November 7, 2021, he had been shot and killed behind the halal market he ran with his brother. Funeral services and a luncheon were held for Aftab and Muhammad at the Islamic Center of New Mexico on August 5, 2022. Several Albuquerque police cars were stationed nearby at the mosque's request, and the department announced it would be increasing its presence near all the mosques in the city for the time being, in light of the murders. One of the more than 1,000 people in attendance at the services was 25-year-old Naeem Hussain. Naeem had come to the United States as a refugee from Pakistan in 2016, fleeing persecution he faced there as a Shia Muslim. He had been a United States citizen for less than a month. Upon his arrival in the United States, he worked as a truck driver, and once he obtained his U.S. citizenship, he began his own trucking company. He took great pride in his job and worked extra shifts when there were supply chain issues because he knew people were relying on goods being delivered. Even before he was officially a citizen, he loved the United States and its citizens and wanted to help them get critical supplies. He was a hard worker who supported himself as well as his family back in Pakistan. He was working to bring his wife to America and looking into purchasing property in Virginia. His brother-in-law described him as the most generous, kind, giving, patient, and down-to-earth person that I could ever meet. Following the funeral, Naeem made plans to meet up with some friends, who also worked as truck drivers, at his apartment, but he never showed up. His friends left his apartment to attend holiday services for Muharram at a Shiite mosque, but Naeem did not show up at the mosque either. He was not answering phone calls or texts, so his friends used an app they utilized to track each other's movements while they were driving their trucks to try to find him. The app showed that Naeem's vehicle was near the intersection of Truman Street and Grand Avenue. His friends arrived at that location around 11:20 p.m. They found Naeem's white 2020 Toyota 4Runner in the parking lot of Lutheran Family Services, where Naeem had previously worked with other refugees as a caseworker, helping them resettle in the area. The vehicle's engine was running and its lights were on. When they got closer, his friends discovered Naeem's body slumped across the front seat, which was covered in his blood. By this time, the Muslim community in Albuquerque was in a state of panic and feeling as though they were being targeted. Some people tried to leave the city and others would not leave their homes. When they did go out, many people chose to travel in groups. The Islamic Center of New Mexico issued a public warning for its members to be cautious, and the governor of New Mexico sent additional state police to Albuquerque after Naeem's murder. The Albuquerque police increased their presence at local mosques, the University of New Mexico, and Muslim-affiliated schools. The amount of fear the murders inspired in the community also inspired community action, which ultimately led to the arrest of a suspect. Hundreds of tips were called in to authorities, and residents who lived near the crime scenes voluntarily uploaded footage from their home surveillance cameras to a portal for law enforcement to examine. This effort resulted in police finding footage of one of the murders, with gunshots appearing on the video, which then showed a vehicle speeding away from the scene. Authorities released an image of a dark silver sedan, which they believed was most likely a Volkswagen Jetta, to the public. The car was described as a vehicle of interest in the 4 murders. The FBI and the Albuquerque police subsequently received numerous tips about a possible suspect who drove such a vehicle. 51-year-old Muhammad Syed. Syed was arrested by FBI agents and Albuquerque police detectives near Santa Rosa, New Mexico, more than 100 miles east of Albuquerque on August 9, 2022. He was driving his Volkswagen Jetta at the time. He claimed he had been going to Texas to look for a new place for his family to live. He cited the unsafe conditions for Muslims in Albuquerque, illustrated by the 4 murders, as his motivation for wanting to move. At this time, he was charged with just 2 murders, the killings of Aftab Hussain and Muhammad Afzal Hussain. Prior to his arrest, investigators had learned that Syed and one of his sons had purchased multiple firearms and firearm accessories from several gun shops in Albuquerque, with the first purchase recorded in January of 2021. 2 of the firearms they purchased were of the same calibers as weapons used in the murders. While searching the Jetta, police found numerous bullet casings. Testing revealed that 2 of them were a match to a casing found at the scene of Muhammad Afzal Hussein's murder. Syed's home was searched at the time of his arrest, and further evidence tying him to the murders was discovered. Numerous firearms were located and collected for testing. A rifle found underneath Syed's bed was found to be the weapon used to kill both Aftab Hussein and Muhammad Afzal Hussein. Syed and his family came to the United States from Afghanistan in 2016. He worked as a truck driver, although apparently not on a regular basis, and the family struggled financially. He was married and had 6 children. His wife and children were the alleged victims of numerous incidents of domestic violence that received police attention. Syed had been arrested on misdemeanor offenses related to these incidents, but the charges were always dropped. Syed's daughter Lubna was a frequent alleged victim of her father's violence over issues like her refusal to allow one of her brothers to chaperone her when she attended college classes and her relationship with the man who would become her husband. She told CNN that her father was initially angry over her 2018 marriage, but had come to be more accepting of it. Her husband was friends with both Aftab Hussein and Naeem Hussein. She did not believe that her father could be a murderer, despite his history of violence. Authorities stated that they found evidence during the search of Syed's home that he knew the 4 victims in at least some capacity, and that they believed interpersonal conflict played a part in the motivation for the murders. Syed had a previous known conflict with the first suspected victim, Muhammad Ahmadi. 2 years prior to his murder, Muhammad had confronted Syed over a suspected food stamp fraud scheme he was trying to carry out at the market Muhammad co-owned with his brother. Syed allegedly purchased large amounts of rice from the market using food stamps and then tried to return it for cash. According to his brother, Muhammad confronted Syed and then refused to let him into the market at all because he did not like dishonest people and would not participate in fraudulent activity. Syed returned to the market at least 3 times to threaten the family and would sit outside the building in his car after being forced to leave. In early 2020, Muhammad and his wife left Friday services at the Islamic Center of New Mexico to find that 2 of the tires on their car had been slashed. Security footage from the mosque showed someone slashing the tires, and the mosque reportedly identified Syed as the culprit. He was then banned from the center. On August 22, 2022, Syed was also charged with the murder of Naeem Hussein. This charge stemmed from the surveillance video of a car similar to Syed's fleeing the scene of the shooting. Ballistics testing also tied Syed to the crime. Syed has so far not been charged with the murder of Muhammad Ahmadi, but investigators have stated that he is the prime suspect in that case. Syed's son, 21-year-old Shaheen Syed, has also faced legal troubles connected to his father's arrest. He was arrested the same day as his father, August 9th, and charged with providing false information when he purchased a firearm in 2021. While purchasing 2 military-style assault rifles at a firearms dealer in Albuquerque, Syed provided an address in Florida on the transaction record, despite not living at the address. In November 2022, he agreed to a plea deal in which he pled guilty and was given a sentence equal to the amount of time he had spent in federal custody since his arrest. He was placed in a halfway house and also given 3 years of supervised release. The younger Syed has not been charged with any of the murders believed to have been committed by his father, although federal agents did testify at his initial detention hearing that there was evidence he helped his father coordinate the ambush-style murders. Shaheen accompanied his father to the gun store to pick up 2 AK-type weapons, one of which was later used in the murders of Aftab Hussein and Muhammad Afzal Hussein. He also went with him to a custom gunsmithing shop where an optical scope was attached to one of their rifles. This work was done on August 1, 2022, just 6 hours prior to the murder of Muhammad Afzal Hussein. Cell phone records also indicate that father and son were cooperating leading up to the murder of Naeem Hussein. The elder Syed followed Naeem from the Islamic Center of New Mexico, where he had attended services for 2 of the other murder victims, to Lutheran Family Services. Shaheen's cell phone connected to his father's phone at 3:39 p.m. near the Islamic Center of New Mexico, 2 minutes before his father drove off, allegedly to follow Naeem. Father and son then had several brief phone conversations. Muhammad Syed has denied any involvement in the murders and remains in custody. 24-year-old Rebecca Contois was the mother of a daughter, and, according to a family friend, she had a heart for everything. She was soft-spoken, but had a friendly personality. Rebecca was a member of the Crane River First Nation, but grew up in Winnipeg. Members of her community came together to help search for her when she suddenly went missing, but when Rebecca was finally located, she was not reunited with her family. On May 16, 2022, her remains were discovered in a garbage bin behind an apartment building in Winnipeg. The following month, more of her remains were located in the Brady Road landfill south of the city. On May 18th, 2 days after Rebecca's remains were first located, police arrested 35-year-old Jeremy Anthony Michael Skibicki and charged him with first-degree murder in connection to Rebecca's death. Authorities have stated that he and Rebecca knew each other, but not in what capacity. They also revealed that they believed there was a possibility that Skibicki had other victims. The extent of the crimes believed to have been committed by Skibicki would not be known for several months. On December 1st, 2022, the Winnipeg Police Service released a press release announcing that Skibicki was now being charged with 3 more counts of first-degree murder, bringing the total of such charges he now faces up to 4. The remains of the other 3 victims have not been located. Winnipeg Police Chief Danny Smythe has stated that their remains are most likely in the landfill where some of Rebecca's remains were located, but police will not be able to search the site because of its massive size. Still, police say that they have enough evidence to recommend charges of first-degree murder for the killings. They also have stated that DNA played a role in this investigation, but have so far not elaborated on how it was used. Due to the ongoing proceedings, they are limited in what information can be released to the public. It is now believed that Rebecca Contois was Skibicki's final victim. The identity of the woman believed to have been Skibicki's first alleged victim has not been determined. Investigators believe she was most likely an Indigenous woman in her 20s and that she was killed around March 15th of 2022. They have released an image of a reversible baby fat brand coat with fur trim, similar to one they believe she owned, and asked anyone who recognizes it and could identify its owner to contact them. The other 2 alleged victims had been identified as 39-year-old Morgan Beatrice Harris and 26-year-old Mercedes Myron. Both women were members of the Long Plain First Nation. It is believed that Morgan was killed on May 1st, 2022, the last day she was seen alive. Morgan was a mother of 5 and a grandmother of 1. She had a strong spirit and was afraid of no one. I want her to be remembered as happy-go-lucky as she was. She was silly, she was fun. People loved to be around her, her daughter Cambria has said. Morgan was homeless at the time of her death, and according to Cambria, when they were out looking for her while she was missing, every person they talked to knew who Morgan was, and no one had a bad thing to say about her. Cambria has been critical of the decision to not further search the landfill for remains, calling the choice disgusting. She believes her mother and the other victims deserve to be brought home. Mercedes is believed to have been killed on May 4th. She had been missing since March, last seen in Winnipeg's North End. She had been living on the streets at the time. Her grandmother, Donna Bartlett, had made appeals to the public trying to find her. A motive for the killings has not been determined. Although Skibicki showed support for openly racist organizations and conspiracy theories on his social media accounts. All of his alleged victims were Indigenous women, although investigators have stated that they cannot be certain if this was intentional or coincidence at this time. Skibicki's ex-wife had been granted a 3-year order of protection against him in September of 2019. Skibicki has been in custody since his arrest for Rebecca's murder in May, and remains at Milner Ridge Correctional Center. He appeared in court on December 2, 2022, where he was directly indicted on the 4 counts of first-degree murder, meaning the case will proceed directly to trial without a preliminary hearing. Skibicki's lawyer says that his client will be pleading not guilty to all of the charges against him. Between March of 1990 and February of 1991, the St. Louis area saw a string of murders attributed to a murderer who came to be known as the Package Killer. This moniker stemmed from the fact that the victims were all found in public areas in large visible containers. 2 victims were found in garbage cans, 1 in a wooden box, and 1 in between 2 mattresses. All of the murders had connections to an area of South St. Louis, known for sex work at the time. The victims were Robin Myhan, 18, Donna Reitmeyer, 40, Brenda Pruitt, 27, and Sandy Little, 21. Robin, Brenda, and Sandy all had young children when they were killed. Sandy's body was the last to be discovered in February of 1991. At that time, the St. Louis Major Case Squad made an arrangement with the FBI. They agreed that the next time the body of a suspected victim of the package killer was found, they would seal off the crime scene and wait for the FBI to arrive and process the evidence. However, there were no more victims and therefore no new pieces of evidence in the case, which then went cold for more than 3 decades. Sandy Little's body had been discovered in O'Fallon, Missouri, giving police there the authority to investigate the case. O'Fallon Police Detective Jody Weber reopened the case in 2008 and worked on it for 14 years before it was finally solved. Technology did not advance to the point where DNA evidence could be identified on any of the evidence in the case until 2022. Even then, some of the DNA evidence had been compromised, and Sandy Little's now adult son, Chris Day Jr., had to provide a sample of his DNA to confirm that his mother's DNA was on the same item as the DNA of her alleged killer. Police reportedly have 4 pieces of physical evidence tied to both the alleged killer and to 3 of the victims through DNA. Once the DNA profile of the killer was developed, finding out who it belonged to proved to be very simple. A match was found during a search of the FBI's combined DNA index system because the alleged killer was incarcerated. On September 19, 2022, prosecutors announced that the package killer had been identified as 73-year-old Gary Muehlberg, an inmate at the Potosi Correctional Center in southeastern Missouri, who was serving life without the possibility of parole for the 1993 murder of a man named Kenneth Atchison. Kenneth was an acquaintance of Muehlberg's who wanted to buy a car from him. Muehlberg killed him, took the money he was going to pay for the car, and hid his body in a makeshift coffin in his basement. The DNA evidence connected Muehlberg to the murders of Robin, Sandy, and Brenda. Detective Weber went to the prison to confront him with this evidence in the summer of 2022. Once prosecutors agreed that he would not face the death penalty, Muehlberg began cooperating with them. He confessed to murdering Robin, Sandy, and Brenda. He also admitted to killing Donna, whose murder was suspected to have been committed by the package killer, but never definitively tied to the other murders until this confession. In addition, Muehlberg claimed that he killed a 5th woman whose name he does not remember. He says that after he killed her, he put her body in a metal barrel, which he left at a self-service car wash. Authorities are working to try to identify this woman and determine what became of her body. Muehlberg is currently facing 4 charges of first-degree murder in the cases of Brenda, Donna, Sandy, and Robin. In a phone interview after his confession, Muehlberg stated that he did not know why he started or stopped his killing spree, as he had paid many other women for sex, but had not killed them. He tried to claim that he confessed to try to do something positive for the victims' families, an assertion that is not supported by the fact that he did not choose to admit to his crimes until he was confronted with physical evidence tying him to them and he knew he would be facing charges. He also wants to quickly confess to and be sentenced for his crimes in court, claiming he wants to spare the victims' families the stress of a trial. However, those who know him say he is most likely more concerned with losing his cell on the honor block in the correctional facility if he is away facing trial for too long. None of the relatives of Muehlberg's victims, who have spoken publicly since Muehlberg's identification, believe he thinks about anyone but himself. At the time of their murders, 42-year-old Vita Hicks, 44-year-old Diane Nelms, 37-year-old Cheryl Ray, and 37-year-old Janice Cox were local sex workers. The only known detail about their lives was their addiction to crack cocaine. On August 1, 1995, Detective De La Torrient from the Miami Police Department arrived at the scene where 42-year-old Vita Hicks' body was discovered. He encountered a growing crowd of onlookers and nearby homeless individuals. Vita's body was found on the ground, burned from the waist up, wearing a mesh shirt and shorts severely scorched to the point where the mesh pattern was imprinted on her skin. Additionally, she had sustained a blow to the head. Initially, De La Torrient suspected she might have accidentally ignited herself while smoking crack cocaine, given the area's reputation for drug activity. However, the head injury prompted him to reconsider, leading him to secure the scene with yellow crime scene tape and investigate the case as a potential homicide. He sent Vita's body to the Dade County morgue for an autopsy. The autopsy revealed that Vita had suffered a severe injury to the head that caused a fractured skull and brain trauma. The blow to the head was determined to be the cause of death, and because she could not have suffered such a severe injury from an accidental fire, there was only one other option. Somebody had intentionally killed Vita Hicks and set her body on fire. 2 months later, on October 1995, a worker at the Albuquerque produce market opened a bay door and stumbled upon a dead body. Detective Frank Castillo from the Miami Police Department and some officers responded to the scene less than 30 feet from where Vita Hicks' body was found. They identified the body as belonging to 44-year-old Diane. She was lying face up and appeared to have the same injuries as Vita, injuries to the face and head, a torso that appeared to be burnt. Detective Castillo immediately cordoned off the crime scene and sent the body to the coroner's office, although he could already tell that the cause of death was likely the head and face injuries. Soon after police began investigating Diane's death, they got another call that a dead body had been found at a cemetery about 3 miles from where the first 2 bodies were found. Detective Jack Calver from the Miami Police Department responded to the scene and became the lead detective. Like Vita and Diane, this body was beaten on the head and burned. She was 37-year-old Cheryl Ray. By this time, police had started to form a theory that a serial killer may be on the loose. All the evidence from the 3 crime scenes so far pointed to the same killer. The methods of killing were the same. The victims were all African-American women and their bodies had all been burnt after they were killed. But this time the killer made a mistake. He had left bodily fluid on Cheryl's body. On March 27, 1996, officers responded to a 911 call at 501 Northwest 29th Street, an abandoned gas station in North Miami. There was a partially nude dead woman lying on the floor, and her name was Janice Cox. The crime scene bore the same now familiar trademark as the previous scenes, wounds to the head and a burnt body. This time, however, Janice was lying next to a pool of transmission fluid. The coroner confirmed the cause of death as a fatal blow to the head. Inside the building at the gas station, the floor around Janice's body was littered with ceiling tiles that had fallen some time before Janice wound up there. This seemingly unimportant detail would be the break the detectives handling the 4 homicides would need to crack the case wide open. The ceiling tiles that the investigators found at the Janice Cox crime scene had landed with the white side up. The killer appeared to have stepped on the pool of transmission fluid found near Janice's body and then stepped on the ceiling tiles. According to Detective Nelson Andrejo, one of the lead detectives in the case, the footprints were fresh, meaning they were likely the killer's footprints. Investigators also knew that, given the locations where the bodies were found, the killer knew the area well. During their investigation, police interviewed over 500 people, including passersby, friends, and families of the victims. Meanwhile, investigators were already getting tips from locals about possible suspects. The most promising lead was an eyewitness account identifying a street thug named Dredd with Cheryl moments before she was killed. Police developed a composite sketch of Dredd and began circulating his picture in case anyone else had any information about him. But despite these promising leads, the case was not moving as quickly as the detectives believed it would. They had nothing tying Dredd to the crime scene, and his only relation to the case was being seen with the 3rd victim shortly before she was murdered. However, Detective Callius believed that the police already had enough to catch the killer, so he set up an operation to find him. On the first day of this operation, he and his partner, Detective Nelson Andrew, would receive a tip to give them the break they needed to close the case. A woman named Yolanda approached Detective Callius, claiming she had information that he might be interested in. Yolanda, a sex worker, said that about a year before these murders, a guy had approached her to solicit her services. The guy had asked her if she spoke Spanish, and when she moved closer to him to respond, he hit her head with a metal pipe. Yolanda started running for her life. Luckily, she escaped her attacker and ran into a gas station where she called 911 and reported the incident. After hearing what she had to say, Detective Callius thanked Yolanda and asked her to call him if she remembered anything else or if she saw her attacker. In truth, he did not think much of her story, as it had happened a year ago and likely had nothing to do with the present case. But just 3 hours later, Callius received a call from Yolanda. She had just seen her attacker riding a bicycle in town. Hoping for a break in the case, Detective Callius and his partner went to pick Yolanda up to try and locate this random man riding a bicycle. Together they drove through the streets of Miami until Yolanda pointed out, "There he is." And we're going around, and all of a sudden she points out, she goes, "There he is." Callius stopped the man and began questioning him. His name was Francisco del Junco, and there was something suspicious about his manner. Hanging from Francisco's bike was a plastic bag with a juice bottle containing gasoline. It just so happened that, in all 4 murders under investigation, gasoline was the accelerant used to set the bodies on fire. It seemed strange to Callius and his partner that a bike without a motor needed a bottle of gasoline. When asked about it, Francisco claimed that his bicycle chain usually fell off, and when he tried to fix it, he would get grease on his hands, so he used the gasoline to wash the grease off his hands afterward. This explanation did not satisfy Detective Andreo, so he asked Francisco if he could see the bottom of his shoe. And sure enough, the shoes had that elusive footprint impression found at the crime scene where Janice Cox's body was found. The detectives, feeling they had a strong enough reason to place Francisco on the suspect list, asked him to come down to the station with them, and he agreed. During the interview, Francisco was cordial with the detectives, but he did not admit to being involved in the murders. Andreo asked Francisco if he knew why somebody would murder these women. He replied that it was impossible to know what drives people to do things like that. So the detectives kept suggesting reasons why someone would commit these crimes, hoping to notice a change in his attitude, an admission, a slip-up, or anything, but Francisco maintained his innocence. And then, out of nowhere, Andrew mentioned Santeria. Immediately, Francisco's mood changed. Santeria, or Regla de Oca, is a religion practiced in Miami and the Caribbean. It is a mixture of the traditional Yoruba religion of West Africa, Catholicism, and Spiritism. People who practice this religion are known as Crentes, or believers. Detective Andrew knew immediately that he had struck a chord, and he could feel the puzzle pieces falling into place. Francisco wanted to go to the beach to talk, and Andrew was all in. At the Miami beach, Francisco began telling the detectives a strange account of his life. He was battling a condition whereby he would be going about his normal daily activities and then suddenly become aroused. And then, without any provocation or stimulation, he would ejaculate. Francisco told the detectives how embarrassing and debilitating this condition was for him. He believed it was all the fault of the Santeria priestesses, who created the voices in his head, and their leader was a black woman. So he targeted black women to get even with the Santeria priestesses. The detectives were having a hard time deciding whether Francisco was truly delusional or if he was telling the story as an excuse for the crimes he was about to confess to. So they needed to look into his past to understand who he was and possibly give clues as to his mental state. Francisco del Junco was born on August 3, 1957 in Cuba. He was the first child of his parents who had a history of mental illness. As a result, Francisco also had mental struggles from a very young age. He developed epilepsy at age 3 and had to begin taking medication for it. Francisco's family was highly dysfunctional and his childhood was rough, but he was educated until the 4th grade. His parents had begun having marital issues soon after they got married, which eventually resulted in a divorce. His father left the family, ignoring Francisco for the rest of his childhood. A therapist later noted that Francisco's childhood was characterized by rejection of others by being different, isolated. When Francisco's mother remarried, her new husband, who became Francisco's stepfather, would constantly abuse him. He also had problems relating with his peers and others outside his family. Still, Francisco had an okay relationship with his mother, and some of his best memories were going to the beach with her. As Francisco grew older, his mental health began to deteriorate. By 16, he began hearing voices in his head that he claimed were caused by black magic being done by some priestesses. The voices in his head made him paranoid, afraid that someone was trying to kill him. He began distancing himself from others as a result. In 1980, Francisco moved to Miami via a Mariel boat lift, which was the period between April 15th and October 31st, 1980, when Cubans emigrated via boat to the U.S. due to Cuba's poor economy. When he arrived in Miami, Francisco began living with some relatives while working multiple jobs. He also began to receive medical attention for his mental illness. He regularly visited a psychiatrist whom he told about the voices in his head and how he often saw images of black ladies or Santeria, priestesses of black magic. He also told a psychiatrist that he often had homicidal thoughts because he was delusional and expressed his frustration about being unable to channel his energy like he wanted to. In 1987, when he was 30 years old, Francisco was admitted to a mental health clinic for the first time. He was admitted again in 1988 and 1992, when he was 31 and 35 respectively. Meanwhile, Francisco held different jobs to support himself. His last job was at Dan Marino's Sports Bar and Grill in Coconut Grove. His employers regarded him as a quiet but model employee. He worked hard, was never late, and often rode to work on his bicycle. As an adult, Francisco had overcome some of his childhood awkwardness and could engage in casual romantic relationships. He deliberately avoided getting into any serious relationship because he knew the problems he was dealing with and he did not want any further complications in his life. Between when he was first admitted in 1987 and 1995, he had several run-ins with police for petty crimes ranging from assaulting an officer to burglary, loitering, and theft. On one occasion in 1987, Francisco swung a chain at one police officer and attempted to take a gun from another while shouting in Spanish, "Long live Fidel." Long live communism. But despite Francisco's priors, the judge deemed him not a threat to society, mostly because of the guarded prognosis he had received from his psychiatrist. A guarded prognosis for Francisco meant that the psychiatrist did not have enough information to accurately determine whether or not Francisco could be a threat to the community in the future. The fact that Francisco missed his last appointment scheduled for January 1993 with his psychiatrist did not stop the psychiatrist from administering the guarded prognosis. The fact that Francisco missed his last appointment scheduled for January 1993 with his psychiatrist did not stop the psychiatrist from administering the guarded prognosis. The judge, relying on this, ruled that Francisco would not threaten society. Perhaps if Francisco had not missed that last appointment, the psychiatrist might have had a different opinion, which might have influenced the judge differently. He did miss the appointment, and so when his victims met him, they believed they would get free drugs in exchange for their services. But what they couldn't possibly have known at the time was that the man soliciting their services in exchange for drugs would be the last client they would ever take. Francisco confessed to Detective Andreo and Detective Callias that he did not commit the murders because he was a racist, but rather because he got a sense of. However, the detectives were still skeptical about his confession, so they needed to verify his account by asking him questions about the murders that only the killer would know. Francisco decided to revisit all the crime scenes to show the detectives that he was not lying. The first stop was where he placed the second body, the Produce Market, near the railway tracks. Next, Francisco led the detectives to the cemetery where Cheryl Ray's body was found. There he demonstrated how he carried out the crime in detail and explained how he lured his other victims to a secluded area before killing them. With this, the detectives believed he was telling the truth. Meanwhile, the detectives could not eliminate Francisco's boots as the one that made the footprints at the Janice Cox crime scene, meaning it could have been him. The final nail in the coffin for Francisco is the DNA from the body fluid recovered at the Cheryl Ray crime scene. On June 3, 1996, police arrested him and charged him with 4 counts of murder. With the overwhelming evidence against Francisco, the task for the judge at the Dade County Circuit Court was to determine whether he was responsible for his actions or he was legally insane and therefore not guilty. Under Florida law, for a defendant to qualify for the defense of legally insane, he must not know the difference between right and wrong. However, despite his bizarre behavior, it was evident from his confession that he understood the difference between right and wrong. But Francisco's defense lawyer told the judge that he was never adequately treated for his mental illness, so his actions resulted from an undiagnosed mental health condition. After a 6-week trial that began in May 2003, Miami-Dade County Judge Alex Ferrer found Francisco del Junco guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. He was not eligible for the death sentence because of his mental illness, so he received 4 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. Now 66 years old, Francisco del Junco, is serving his sentence at the Miami-Dade County Jail. His victims have received justice and their families can now move on with their lives. Francisco's life was a series of tragedies that all contributed to his mental health and psychopathic behavior. However, the only crimes his victims committed was encountering the man who would take their lives from them. In 1980, 22-year-old Dale Nancy Wyman resided on Washington Avenue in the city of Vanier, Ontario. Although she had confided to some family members about her desire to leave home due to her father's abuse, they did not anticipate her leaving without notifying anyone of her destination. Nonetheless, on July 16, 1980, Dale left home with a suitcase and took a cab to a bus station on Catherine Street, without informing anyone of her plans. Her family never heard from her again. During the investigation into her disappearance, police interviewed the primary witness, the taxi driver who had transported Dale to the bus station. He reported that Dale had mentioned she was uncertain about her final destination but was contemplating traveling to either Toronto or Montreal. He also said that when he went inside the bus terminal, after dropping Dale off to get a cup of coffee, he had seen Dale talking with two other young adults who have never been identified. Tips called into police placed Dale in Alberta in 1991 and Toronto in 1992, but the sightings were never substantiated. Dale's family received a phone call from a hospital in Saskatoon trying to locate the family of an individual in their care, but this did not lead them to Dale. This call did lead to retired RCMP officer Linda Davidson, who is now the director of an organization called Murdered Unidentified Cold Case Investigations, investigating hospital records and unidentified remains from this area, when she began working on the case as a private investigator decades later. In May of 2021, in honor of Dale's 63rd birthday, there was a new appeal to the public for information about the case. Police in Ottawa released a new age progress sketch of what Dale might look like, along with a video message recorded by Dale's sister, Brenda Larsh. In it, Brenda stated, "Dale is deeply missed by her brother and two sisters. Our hearts hold an empty space for her, and we pray and hope that someone may remember her in any way. Please help us to resolve this and find some peace and closure. Thank you, and God bless for any tips brought forward." Brenda also spoke directly to her sister in case she saw the message, saying that she loved her and wishing her a happy birthday. It would be this effort that would ultimately lead to the resolution of Dale's case. On August 10, 2022, Ottawa police announced that a third party had eventually seen the age-progressed image of Dale and called to report that Dale had been living outside of Canada and had recently passed away. Ottawa Police's Missing Persons Unit followed up on the tip and was able to confirm the information. At the time, authorities did not release any further information about what had become of Dale. However, it was later disclosed that the third party who had called in was Dale's daughter. Dale had made a life for herself in Ohio, where she had a family. She passed away just 2 months before her daughter saw the age-progressed image and learned that she was a missing person, whose family had never given up the search for her. Dale's siblings are struggling to accept this new information, as well as the fact that Dale passed away just before they found her. Dale's daughter has been put in contact with her family in Canada. In May of 1990, 35-year-old Myrtle Brown needed some time away, so she traveled to New York City to visit her best friend. However, the trip proved to be anything but relaxing. While in the city, someone stole her purse, which held all of her money, her identification, and medication she used to treat her epilepsy. Myrtle called her mother back home to tell her about the robbery. She also mentioned that she was not feeling well, and that she would have to find a hospital where she could obtain an emergency refill on her prescription. Myrtle's family never heard from her again. They reported her missing and went to New York, where they spent weeks visiting hospitals and police stations looking for her with no success. They had to return home without answers, and decades would pass with no information about what became of Myrtle. Myrtle's daughter Ebony, who was just 13 years old when her mother went missing, struggled with going through the milestones in her life without her mother, especially because she did not know for sure if her mother was absent from her life voluntarily or not. Myrtle's family would not receive any new information about her case for more than 30 years. In April of 2022, the month before the 32nd anniversary of Myrtle's disappearance, Myrtle's brother Robert was watching NBC's Nightly News with Lester Holt. The show aired a segment about a cold case squad working out of the New York City office of the chief medical examiner to determine the identities of more than 1,200 unidentified sets of remains located in New York City over the course of the past several decades. During the segment, Robert saw one facial reconstruction that he believed looked like his sister. He decided to contact the unit to see if they could help him determine if the woman depicted in the reconstruction could be Myrtle. Dr. Angela Soler, the assistant director of forensic anthropology, and her team began looking into Myrtle's case. The woman in the reconstruction that initially inspired Robert to call was proven not to be Myrtle, but Dr. Soler and her team continued researching to see if Myrtle was in fact one of the unidentified individuals in their caseload. Using Myrtle's physical details and the timing of her disappearance, the team was able to identify a potential match after more than 2 months of work. Dr. Soler notified Robert and Ebony about the potential match over a phone call. To see if they were correct, the team had to send them a photograph of an unidentified individual taken after they had passed away. When Ebony and Robert saw the photograph, they were able to confirm that the woman was Myrtle. Her family finally learned the details of what had happened to her. Myrtle had suffered a seizure while waiting in the emergency room at Kings County Hospital and passed away. However, she died during a brief period of bureaucratic limbo that prevented her from being quickly identified and her family from being notified of her death. She had not yet registered with or been admitted to the hospital, so when her family searched for her, there was not a record of her being a patient there. Since her purse had been stolen, she had no identification with her when she died. Internal records do show that she did provide her name and date of birth to the hospital when she arrived to the emergency room, which helped the cold case unit identify her more than 30 years later. The Brown family was able to hold a virtual memorial for Myrtle after she was identified. They say that they now have peace knowing what happened to Myrtle. Paul McGinty, originally from Mont Charles in County Donegal, Ireland, was one of 9 siblings. Like many Irish men, he moved to England for work in the 1960s, spending time in London before relocating to Coventry, where he supported himself through construction work. In 1991, at the age of 51, Paul was facing a tough period, having become unemployed. Despite managing to pay his rent, he suddenly disappeared on April 8th, leaving all his belongings behind. Although Paul's friends attempted to prompt local authorities to investigate his disappearance, the police showed little interest in the case. Even though Paul no longer lived nearby, he had maintained contact with his family in Ireland. His sister Eileen saw him in person for the last time in 1987, when he came home to attend their brother's funeral. They would call each other for Christmas and Easter, and a few times in between each year. When she called the home where he had been staying one day in 1991, his landlord informed her that Paul had gone missing. Eileen would be the only one of Paul's siblings to live long enough to see his disappearance solved more than 30 years later. On April 18, 1991, a man's body was found in Bracetown, County Meath. Foul play was not suspected in his death, but the man had no identification on him. And since his identity was unknown, his next of kin could not be notified of his death. The man had been seen around the county in the week previous, talking with locals at a pub and attending a Gaelic Athletic Association match, but no one who had seen or interacted with him knew his name. He had looked disheveled and had been living as a transient once he arrived in the area. The man's body was photographed, as were his belongings, including the gray herringbone coat he had been found wearing and the St. Christopher medal he carried with him. 7 months of investigation did not uncover the man's identity. He was then buried in a grave marked only by a small stone in St. Mary's Cemetery in Navan. A renewed effort to learn the unidentified man's identity began in 2021. His remains were exhumed in hopes of collecting a DNA sample, but things did not go according to plan. Forensic Science Ireland ultimately concluded that a usable DNA sample could not be collected, which can sometimes happen based on circumstances during the exhumation or the extent or nature of how the bones had degraded. Investigators then turned to the other evidence they had in an effort to solve the case. The man's body had been discovered within a day or two of his death, meaning it had not yet decomposed very much. so the photographs investigators took of his body, at the time it was found, gave a good idea of what the man had looked like in life. Because the photographs were such high quality, they were sent to a forensic artist who drew an image of what the man would have looked like before his death. This image was subsequently shown on the RTE television program Crime Call in hopes that someone would recognize him. A man named Michael Leonard happened to be watching the program the night it aired in his home in County Donegal. He nearly fell out of his chair when he saw the artist rendering on the screen, as he immediately recognized it as Paul McGinty. Michael had met Paul decades earlier when Paul and Michael's brother John worked together in Coventry. John had seen Paul just the day before he disappeared. Other members of the Leonard family had met Paul as well, and they had all never forgotten him, wondering what had become of him in the decades after he disappeared, when Michael told the other members of his family about the composite image. Theo also recognized it as Paul upon seeing it. Michael then went to see Paul's sister Eileen to show her the image, and she too immediately recognized it as her brother. She went to the authorities to begin the process of confirming the identification. In November of 2022, a coroner's inquest was held in Mead Coroner's Court, outlining the details of the case and formally identifying the previously unidentified man, found in April of 1991 as Paul McGinty. It is unknown what brought Paul to County Mead, as he had no known ties there. His lone surviving sibling, his sister Eileen, who is now in her 80s, was able to attend the inquest and see her brother's case officially solved after more than 3 decades. In 1993, 36-year-old Suzanne Pavy lived with her husband of 9 years, Daryl, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Melissa and 6-year-old Adam. The couple had a happy marriage, and Suzanne was loved by everyone in her extended family. Suzanne worked nights at the Sands and McDougall Stationery Shop on John Street in Salisbury, north of Adelaide, South Australia. On the night of April 29, 1993, Suzanne did not return from work at her usual time. Her husband Daryl tried calling the store multiple times, but his wife never answered the phone. He therefore decided to drive down to the store to check on her. When he arrived, he saw that his wife's car was still in the parking lot. The lights were still on in the store, and the door was still unlocked when he tried it. He cheerfully sang out his wife's name as he walked inside. He did not receive a response. When he reached the counter, he finally realized that something terrible had happened. The back storage door was open, and he could see his wife's legs on the floor. He also saw a large quantity of blood. Suzanne was lying on her back, with her purse, which appeared to have been gone through, next to her. When Daryl got to his wife, he checked for a pulse and noticed that her hands had been badly cut. He tried performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on her, but had to remove a rolled-up piece of paper from her mouth before he could do so. Suzanne had suffered extensive stab wounds in what would later be described by authorities as a ferocious attack. Many of the stab wounds were inflicted to her back as she tried to escape her killer. Authorities believed Suzanne's killer entered the store around 9 p.m. while she was counting the money from the register to close down for the night, as approximately $300 was missing from the store. The $200 Suzanne had taken out from the bank earlier that day to pay for some mechanical repairs was also missing from her purse. Because she always worked the closing shift at the store, and service stations in the area were often robbed, Suzanne and her husband had discussed what she would do in the event of a robbery in the past. She had always stated that she would hand over the money to a robber without hesitation, because she would not risk her life for the cash. Despite an extensive police investigation, Suzanne's case went cold. It would be more than 26 years before an arrest was made in the case. On September 20th, 2019, 46-year-old Matthew Donald Tilley was arrested in Ballarat, Victoria, in connection to Suzanne's murder. He was subsequently extradited to South Australia to face the murder charge. He pled not guilty. Following Tilley's arrest, Suzanne's daughter Melissa released a statement thanking the police and expressing some of the complex emotions the arrest had brought on for her and her family. It would be Tilley's own blood and one of his blood relatives that ultimately identified him as Suzanne's killer. In addition to the large amount of Suzanne's blood found at the scene, blood from an unknown and in 3 locations around the entrance to the store, A DNA profile from the blood was identified by 1999, but there was no match to it in the national database. Eventually, however, authorities discovered a familial match to the DNA profile in the database. While they still did not have a direct match to the DNA from the crime scene, they did find a partial match, meaning the individual they found in the database was related to the person who left their blood at Suzanne's crime scene. The individual in the database was Daniel Tilley, the brother of Matthew Tilley. Investigators began looking at all the members of Daniel's family, which ultimately led them to investigate Matthew Tilley. They traveled to Victoria to meet with him and spoke to him outside. When Matthew threw out his coffee cup in a trash can along the street, they collected it and had the saliva left behind on it tested for DNA. It was a match to the DNA found at the crime scene. Another DNA sample was taken from Tilley in a more clinical setting and confirmed the match. At the time of Suzanne's murder, Tilley's mother had lived just a few streets away from the store where Suzanne was killed. He was working at a service station at the time and claimed to have been at work on the night of the murder. Although by 2019, the records that would have proven or contradicted that claim were no longer available. In the years since the murder, he had moved to Victoria, gotten married, and fathered 4 sons. Tilley's 4-week-long trial began in November of 2021. His defense relied heavily on the possibility that the DNA from the crime scene had been contaminated at some point during the 26 years between Suzanne's murder and Tilley's arrest. His lawyer did not have direct evidence that the DNA was contaminated, but argued that it was not her responsibility to provide such evidence. Rather, the prosecution was obligated to prove that it had not been contaminated. She did present news footage showing law enforcement not wearing gloves or foot coverings at the crime scene. She also argued that while the amount of blood that did not belong to Suzanne found at the scene was enough to fill a vial, her client had not had any cuts to his hands at the time of the murder, although how this could be proven is unclear. On the night of the murder, but none of them had matched Tilley's description, and none of Tilley's fingerprints were found inside the store. The jury was not persuaded by these arguments, however. After 4.5 hours of deliberation, they came back with a guilty verdict. Tilley was sentenced to life in prison, with his non-parole period set at 26 years after court proceedings in March of 2022. Tilley was identified because his brother, Daniel Tilley's DNA was in the police database and came up as a familial match to the DNA at the crime scene. Daniel Tilley has reacted violently to his brother's arrest and conviction, attacking members of the media on 3 different occasions throughout his brother's legal proceedings. The most recent incident occurred in September of 2022 when he exited court and charged at a waiting cameraman, shoving him to the ground with enough force to cut his head. Daniel Tilley continuously swore throughout the attack, which he carried out in full view of a bus full of schoolchildren, and had to be contained by sheriff's officers, who subsequently denied him re-entry to the courtroom for later proceedings. Appearing in court in November of 2022 for charges stemming from this incident, as well as one that occurred in March of 2022, Daniel Tilley stated that he would be contesting the assault charges he was facing. He did state that he intended to plead guilty to a property damage charge he faced for throwing a microphone that belonged to Channel 9 News against a wall on the day his brother was sentenced. Matthew Tilley is currently appealing his conviction and wants it overturned on the grounds that the trial judge misdirected jurors and gave an unbalanced summary of the evidence at his trial. His legal team argued at his first appeal hearing that he is only tied to the crime through his DNA, which they allege calls his guilt into question. Suzanne's family has stated that they hope her case and Tilley's conviction after so many years had passed will give hope to other families of cold case victims still waiting for justice. On January 13, 1972, everything seemed normal in the Randall household. 32-year-old Juanita Randall was busy preparing a family meal in the kitchen, while her 9-year-old daughter, Debbie Randall, was eagerly looking forward to playing at the nearby playground, just 2 blocks from their home. Before Debbie could head out, Juanita asked her to pick up some washing powder from the laundromat across the street on her way back. With a smile and a wave, Juanita said goodbye, unaware that this would be the last time she would see her joyful daughter. Tragically, Debbie never returned home. What could have happened to young Debbie on that seemingly ordinary day? And where did she disappear to after setting off for the playground? Marietta, Georgia, with a population of around 60,000, is known for its diverse community and strong civic pride. Residents here often engage in various community activities and events, creating a welcoming and vibrant atmosphere. This city offers a mix of historic charm and modern amenities, making it an attractive place to live for a diverse group of individuals and families. Marietta's population rate reflects its appeal as a desirable community in the state of Georgia. Let's start the story and take a journey back in time to August 21st, 1962, when a lovely little girl came into the world. Debbie Randall was born to John Randall and Juanita Wheeler Randall in the cozy town of Marietta, Georgia. She attended Pine Forest Elementary School in Georgia, where she was in 3rd grade, and her kind and gentle nature made her a beloved friend among her classmates. Beyond school walls in the tight-knit community, she was adored by everyone, and people often brought dolls for her when they visited her home as tokens of their affection. Debbie also had a big brother named Marvin Randall, and their bond was something truly special. Marvin loved his little sister and would always go above and beyond to make her happy. Whatever Debbie wished for, Marvin made it happen, highlighting the strong and caring connection they shared as siblings. Debbie was a source of joy for her family, and she had grand dreams and a heart filled with adventure. However, her life was cut short and never truly got the chance to fully chase those dreams and live life to the fullest. It was an ordinary evening on January 13th, 1972, when Debbie was at her home in Marietta, Georgia, with her mother Juanita and her brother Marvin, who was feeling a bit under the weather, so he was resting in his room. It was shaping up to be an ordinary evening. Juanita was in the kitchen, busy preparing dinner while John, Debbie's father, had yet to return home. Suddenly, with a burst of enthusiasm, Debbie went to her room, quickly dressed herself, and returned back to her mother with an eager request to go play at the nearby playground with her friends. This playground was just a stone's throw away, a mere half block and a quick 57 feet from their house. Right across the road, there was a laundromat. Juanita remembered that she had forgotten to grab some washing powder from there. So she'd granted Debbie's request to play. She asked her to run a small errand. "While you're out, dear," she said, "please don't forget to pick up the washing powder we need." With a cheerful nod, Debbie happily ventured outside to join her friends at the playground, and didn't forget to promise her mother that she'd return home before dinner time. Little did they know that this simple request would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt their lives for years to come. The playground was just a mere 5-minute stroll for Debbie. Her usual routine was to play for about an hour and then head back home. So Juanita naturally thought she'd be back in roughly an hour and a half. However, when 2 hours slipped by with no sign of Debbie, Juanita began to wonder. She thought, maybe she's at the laundromat, imagining the crowd there was causing the delay. But as 3 hours came and went, the sun sat below the horizon. Juanita's concern grew stronger. This was far from the normal. And as the evening darkened, Juanita's worry also deepened. Debbie had always been punctual and never missed her curfew before. By 9:45 p.m., when John, Debbie's father, finally arrived home, Juanita couldn't contain her concern any longer. She anxiously asked him if he had seen or been with Debbie on his way home. But John's face mirrored her distress when he said that he had no information about Debbie's whereabouts. The worry that had begun as a tiny spark now blazed into a full-fledged concern for their beloved daughter. At the moment, listening to the voice, Martin also emerged from his room, and he couldn't help but notice the worry etched across his parents' faces. Being concerned, he inquired about what was happening. One Nita, torn between protecting her ailing son and the growing anxiety over Debbie's absence, finally broke down in tears. She told Martin that Debbie hadn't returned home, and she and John were going out to search for her. With a heavy heart, Juanita asked Martin to stay behind, keeping an eye on the house and let them know immediately if Debbie returned. It was a moment of heart-wrenching decisions for the family. Fear and confusion swept through the neighborhood as the Randall family sprang into action to find young Debbie. Martin, being a caring older brother, couldn't bear to stay home and do nothing. He roamed the neighborhood, approaching people with questions burning in his mind. "Have you seen Debbie? Do you know where she is?" The response was unanimous shock. No one could believe that their beloved little Debbie was missing without a trace. Some recalled glimpsing her as she left her house, but no one had seen her since. Meanwhile, Juanita and John hurried to the playground where Debbie went to play with her friends, but it was eerily deserted. All the children had already returned to their homes. Their next stop was the laundromat, where Juanita had asked Debbie to fetch washing powder, but it too was closed by then. The minutes ticked away, and every empty road and quiet street they searched seemed to amplify the silence of their daughter's absence. Where could their beloved Debbie have disappeared to? At a moment, Juanita stumbled upon a box of washing powder scattered on the road that led to their home. It was a moment of realization that something terribly wrong might have happened to her daughter. Overwhelmed by worry, Juanita could not hold back her tears any longer. She made the difficult decision to file a missing person report, determined to do everything in her power to find her daughter. However, the police explained that, as less than 24 hours had passed since Debbie went missing, they couldn't officially file the report just yet. Still, they promised to do their best to locate her. Despite this devastating setback, the Randall family was touched by the outpouring support from the community during this difficult time, launching a citywide search effort which involved approximately 4,000 volunteers. Martin also took to the streets posting flyers with a desperate plea for information about his missing sister. Debbie, who had a fondness for playing baseball with her brother, was dearly missed by her family, and Martin hoped that someone, somewhere, had seen or knew something that could bring her back home. At the same time, the police were equally determined to find Debbie. They visited the laundromat where the owner confirmed that Debbie had picked up the washing powder as instructed. But the question was, what could have transpired in those mere 5 minutes between her visit to the laundromat and her disappearance? The police also interviewed all of Debbie's friends who had been at the playground that day, but none had any information about her whereabouts. 16 long days passed, and yet there was no sign of Debbie. Juanita and John were still hoping and waiting anxiously for their beloved daughter to return home safely. Among the dedicated searchers were a group of Southern Tech students who tirelessly assisted the police. After 16 days, on January 29, 1972, their unwavering efforts eventually led them to a tragic discovery on Johnson Ferry Road. On the other side of the woods, they found Debbie's lifeless, partially unclothed body. Her body bore the harrowing signs of a fierce struggle, as if she had fought with all her might until her very last breath to defend herself. It appeared that the heartless killer had used Debbie's own coat to silence her cries for help. Investigators believed that the perpetrator must have been stalking Debbie for some time, patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. He eventually seized the opportunity, abducting and subjecting her to a horrifying ordeal at various locations, before ultimately discarding her lifeless body in the woods. This heartbreaking discovery left the community in deep sorrow, and Debbie's parents were overwhelmed with the grief at the sight of their beloved daughter's lifeless form. The coroner's examination revealed that she had been strangled and assaulted, bearing deep marks on her body that hinted at the immense pain she endured. During this examination, a significant discovery was made: an unidentified hair possibly belonging to her assailant. This find had the potential to be a breakthrough in the case. However, due to the limitations of medical technology in the 1970s, there was little they could do with the hair at the time. So it was carefully preserved, waiting for future advancements that might one day help uncover the identity of the person responsible for Debbie's tragic demise. As the days turned into months, detectives tirelessly pursued hundreds of leads, yet each one seemed to lead nowhere. Despite their dedicated efforts, the police found themselves in a frustrating loop, unable to uncover the vital clues needed to solve the case. These turn of events left the Randall family with haunting questions. What truly transpired on that tragic night? Who bore the responsibility for their daughter's demise? They grappled with not only the profound loss of their cherished Debbie, but also with the agonizing frustration of justice eluding them. For nearly 28 years, the puzzle of Debbie's murder remained without a solution. However, in 2001, fate intervened, giving the case a new chance. Detective Morris Nix, who couldn't shake the memory of this unsolved mystery, began to comb through old cold case files. As he pored over those documents, he stumbled upon Debbie's murder case. Diving back into the details, he felt like there were concealed aspects that hadn't been thoroughly examined. In the initial 1972 investigation, Following his instincts, Detective Morse made the choice to reopen the case. He retrieved the evidence box, which had been tucked away for years, and inside it, he found an unidentified strand of hair that had been preserved with care. The FBI conducted numerous tests on it, but even with their efforts, they couldn't determine whose hair it was. The technology at the time just wasn't that advanced enough, so they wait for the day to finally bring the breakthrough in the case. This case stayed unresolved, but in 2015, it gained momentum again when Detective Morris volunteered for the Cobb County Cold Case Unit. He brought fresh eyes in the aid of advanced medical science, determined to crack the mystery that had baffled the police 46 years earlier. With the help of the media coverage which shone a spotlight on this old case, a woman named Sandra Walker emerged from the shadows. She had been one of the kids who played with Debbie on that fateful evening of January 13, 1972. Sandra bravely recounted her memories to the police. Although fear had kept her silent at the time, those memories were etched in her mind. She recounted nearly being run over by the man's speeding vehicle and the sensation of his eyes locked under her through the rear-view mirror. She could still hear Debbie's desperate screams and see her kicking as the man forcibly pushed her back into his truck. All the memories still haunted her to this day. To engage the entire community and reignite their memories of that fateful night, the police enlisted the help of a graphic designer. With the street now transformed into a bus terminal, Jessica Knoll took a fresh perspective on the case. Freelance artist Amanda would dedicate it once to crafting a visual representation of Debbie's last moments. Given Debbie's fondness for dolls, she chose to depict her story in the form of a doll, with her killer portrayed as the menacing monster in this tragic tale. This creative approach aimed to draw attention of the community once again and help uncover potential clues in the case. John, Debbie's father, held onto every newspaper article that recounted her disappearance, a constant reminder of the lingering sorrow and the mysteries that were left unsolved in their hearts. In the meantime, Detective Morris took a significant step by sending a piece of cloth, a circular one adorned with floral prints, which had been found on Debbie's body, to the Sorensen Forensic Lab for a fresh round of DNA analysis. Thanks to advancements in technology, they managed to construct a partial profile of an unknown male. However, they faced some challenges, but fortunately in 2019, with additional funding from the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council, renewed DNA testing opened up new avenues for further investigation. In 2023, a breakthrough emerged as the police turned to the power of genetic genealogy. They enlisted DNA Labs International to conduct more tests aiming to create AS&P's profile by combing through public records and police resources. When the DNA matched to an individual, the investigators wasted no time and began building a family tree, painstakingly tracing down as many members from the assailant's family as possible. By reaching out to all of the killer's family members and requesting their DNA samples. To their surprise, the family agreed and cooperated willingly by providing their DNA for testing. When all the necessary tests were completed, the DNA evidence found on Debbie was a perfect match. The killer was identified as William B. Rose from Mableton. However, the twist was that Rose took his own life in 1974, just 2 years after he abducted and killed Debbie. At that time, he was only 24 years old. The reason behind Rose's decision to take his own life was driven by fear. Even during the previous arrest for an alcohol-related incident, he lived in constant fear, as revealed by one of his family members who spoke to the police. The authorities believed that Rose must have harbored a deep fear that one day the police might catch up to him for the terrible crime he committed. To avoid facing the consequences, he chose to end his life before that could happen. Remarkably, during the initial investigation, Rose had never even appeared on the police's radar, making his identity as Debbie's killer all the more unexpected. While it seemed unlikely that Rose and Debbie were close acquaintances, there was a connection through their families as both resided in the same complex. In that neighborhood, children often played together on a nearby playground. This suggested the possibility that Rose might have seen Debbie on previous occasions, and when the opportunity presented itself, he carried out his sinister plan. To definitively confirm Rose as the real killer, the police, with the family's consent, exhumed his body after nearly 5 decades. They conducted various tests, and the results left no room for doubt that William B. Rose was indeed the perpetrator, who tragically took the life of 9-year-old Debbie Randall in a horrific manner. The long-awaited revelation of the perpetrator's identity brought closure to the case, but it was bittersweet. Sadly, Debbie Randall's parents, Juanita and John, never learned that the mystery of their daughter's death had finally been solved. Juanita passed away in 2018 after battling with leukemia, and John followed in 2022. Losing a child, especially at such a young age, is a pain beyond words. This family had waited patiently for decades, hoping for answers, could never replace the profound sorrow of losing Debbie Randall. After a relentless pursuit of justice for his sister spanning 5 decades, Debbie's brother Marvin expressed his heartfelt sentiments, saying, "I wish my mother was here, but I know she's in heaven now, and it's finally over. We want to say thank you to all of you for making this day possible. We wish that Debbie's soul finds eternal peace." What are your thoughts on this case? Why would Rose have killed little Debbie? Was that just because he got a chance that day? Or was it already planned? We'd love to hear from you. If there's a case you'd like us to cover, don't hesitate to drop your recommendations in the comments section below. 16-year-old Billy Carroll was a well-known figure in his Chicago neighborhood, known for his friendliness and humor. Despite his outgoing personality, Billy had his secrets. He spent little time at home or school, preferring to spend most of his days on the streets. Even his friends were unsure of what he did with his time. Though he came from a poor family, he always seemed to have money, which was unusual for their uptown area. He used his cash to buy food and nicer things, like skates, which were not common among local kids. He also generously used his money to provide food and clothes for his friends. Billy was resourceful and determined to earn money, sometimes resorting to less than legal means. As a middle child of 3, Billy's family struggled to make ends meet, particularly because of his younger sister Caroline, who was born with severe disabilities. Eventually, the family made the tough decision to place Caroline in a residential facility, where she lived until her death in 2012. Both of Billy's parents struggled with alcohol abuse and were abusive, leading to frequent physical altercations between Billy and his father, sometimes in self-defense and sometimes to protect his mother. After watching the 1972 Olympics on television, Billy became focused on working out. He joined the local YMCA so he could swim, box, and lift weights. Samuel Stapleton was born in Chicago, but grew up in a humble home with no running water in the woods near the Ohio-Kentucky border. While his family did not have much money, Sam thrived as he ran wild through the woods, getting dirty and scraped up as he climbed trees and jumped into creeks. Sam's family eventually moved to Chicago for more economic opportunities, living in multiple neighborhoods over time. When his family moved to the Chicago neighborhood of Uptown, he made a point of identifying and then easily beating up the toughest kid in the neighborhood before his family's belongings were even brought into their apartment so as to immediately secure a tough reputation with the other kids. He knew how to defend himself physically and how to respond when someone was taking advantage of him, something he appears to have inherited from his mother, Bessie. He was streetwise and knew how to navigate around the various gangs that operated in his neighborhood. In May of 1976, Sam was preparing to enter high school. He looked forward to joining ROTC at Sen High School. He had his first job as a delivery boy for a local pizza shop and hoped to soon have even better employment. A contractor calling himself John would call the Stapleton home asking for Sam, with the promise of a job with his company. The boy Sam beat up upon his arrival to Uptown was Randy Reffitt, who did not harbor a grudge over the fight. The two boys were not close friends, but managed to coexist as two of the toughest kids in their neighborhood. Randy was one of 4 children, and his family originally hailed from Kentucky. His father was abusive towards his mother, and the children sometimes tried to protect her from him. They all, including Randy, would sometimes run away for brief periods when their home life became too difficult to deal with, but they always came home after a short time. He was just 15 years old when he disappeared on May 14, 1976. Dale Landegan moved around extensively as a child, which was reflected in his name. His name was really Frank, but his father nicknamed him Del because he had been born in Delaware, which eventually evolved into Dale. He and his 4 sisters all adored their mother. After years of living in Brooklyn, The family moved to Chicago's uptown neighborhood in 1969 to escape growing crime in New York and join Dale's great-uncle Pablo, who owned an apartment building where he offered Dale's family a unit. Dale liked to play pranks, although he could sometimes take them too far, once convincing his family that he had been hit by a car and killed at a gas station. He could come off as aggressive and pushy, but could ultimately win over friends. In February of 1978, 19-year-old Billy Kindred was in love with his girlfriend, Mary Jo. The young couple planned to marry once Billy found a good job. One night, however, Billy failed to show up for their nightly meeting, and all his belongings were found left in his bedroom. Mary Jo reported him missing and spent months driving around Chicago looking for him after she got off of work. When Mary Jo first met Billy, she took note of how physically attractive she found him, but she had truly been drawn in by his kind smile. He respected her, and he respected his elders, which won him the approval of Mary Jo's mother and grandmother. Gregory Godzik was a hockey player, but he did not have the aggressive personality associated with the sport. Sometimes people would try to fight him, but he had little patience for such things. He was instead kind-hearted with a carefree nature. He lived with his parents and sister and was the grandson of Polish immigrants. He had left a job with a lumber company because he had been paid so well by John Wayne Gacy for contracting work. John Sitch was the middle child of 5. He loved animals from a young age and kept pets ranging from bullfrogs to albino hamsters. He regularly brought home stray dogs and cats from the neighborhood to care for as well. As a child, he was an altar server at Chicago's oldest Polish church and attended the parish school. His family moved to the suburb of Des Plaines just before he began his junior year of high school, and he quickly made friends with the members of the school's drama department, hanging out with them in the woods after school. He also got a job at a local pet store. One of his high school friends described him as a sweetheart and claimed to have never seen John without a smile. He remained close with his friends in Chicago even after he moved, and returned there for parties and nights out, although he was not a big drinker. 20-year-old David Talsma volunteered for the Marines in 1977. He was on inactive duty when he had plans to attend a concert in Hammond, Indiana, on the evening of December 9, 1977. He had made arrangements to meet up with a young woman there around 2 a.m., but he never showed up. He instead vanished. 15-year-old Rob Piest kept a busy schedule. He was an honor student at Maine West High School. He was 2 merit badges and a community service project, shy of reaching his goal of becoming an Eagle Scout. Extracurricular activities like working tech on his school play or gymnastics kept him at school until 5:30 p.m. And on most days, his mother would pick him up from school with a hot meal that he would eat on his way to work. His 6 to 9 p.m. shift at Neeson's Pharmacy. His co-workers there would later describe him as a wholesome kid who they could not envision ever smoking or using swear words. He was kind and polite, sometimes loaning his coat to the girl working the front register, who was subjected to cold air when the door to the store was opened. He was supposed to go home after his shift on December 11, 1978 to eat cake to celebrate his mother's 46th birthday, but he instead left with John Wayne Gacy to discuss a summer job with his construction company. Rob had just been denied a raise at the pharmacy, and Gacy's rate of $5 an hour was nearly double what he was making there. He was saving up to buy a Jeep with $900 already put aside for the eventual purchase once he could drive. John Prestige grew up in Michigan, mainly in the Kalamazoo area. His father lived in a trailer there, and his mother and stepfather owned a beehive farm in a nearby town. He began taking healthcare classes part-time at Kalamazoo Valley Community College after graduating high school, paying for them by working at a local motel. He did not get along with management there and traveled whenever he could to get away from the stresses of his everyday life. He had gone to New Orleans for Mardi Gras in February of 1977, and the following month, he was in Chicago visiting a friend. As he made his way out to Colorado to go skiing, 17-year-old Michael Bonin lived near Wrigley Field with his father, stepmother, and younger sister before going missing on June 3, 1976. His fishing license was later found inside Gacy's home. He was athletic, a talented wrestler and baseball player. At the time of his disappearance, he had been working at a gas station. Russell Nelson was an architecture student at the University of Minnesota, who came to Chicago in the fall of 1977, towards the beginning of a long road trip that would take him as far north as Toronto and as far south as Florida. He was a talented dancer who had won competitions back in Minnesota. He was last heard from on October 17, 1977, when he called his mother to wish her a happy birthday. According to his mother, he and a friend had been doing work for a contractor. While in Chicago, Russell also left behind a fiancée. As the son of a police sergeant, 18-year-old Robert Gilroy received one of the most extensive investigations into his disappearance when he first went missing. His father conducted his own investigation, and his file with the Chicago police consists of more than 40 pages. Robert disappeared on September 15, 1977. After telling his parents he was going to his horseback riding lesson in Northbrook, although he had in fact stopped attending the lessons weeks earlier. He was not reported missing until nearly 2 weeks later because he was supposed to be at a camp in Gaithersburg, Maryland. He never made it to the camp. Rick Johnston lived in the suburb of Bensonville, but was last seen in Chicago when his mother dropped him off in front of the Aragon Ballroom in the Uptown neighborhood. Multiple bands were playing the venue that night, but Rick told his mother he would call her for a ride home after the band Spirit played their set. He never made that call. His family feared he had been recruited by a cult because of his recent interest in religion and studying the Bible. They traveled as far as Washington, D.C. to look for Rick amongst the congregants of Reverend Moon's Unification Church at one of their rallies. 19-year-old Darrell Sampson was a native of West Virginia who was living in Chicago's Uptown neighborhood when he went missing in April of 1976. He had previously run away as a juvenile in 1973 in an effort to get out of a court appearance related to curfew violations. Within a few days, he was at his father's house in Virginia. After he disappeared in 1976, he would not be seen again until his remains were found under Gacy's dining room floor. The end of 1978. The family of Matthew Bowman of Crystal Lake, Illinois had already lost one of its members to homicide. Matthew's stepfather, Anthony Rovatuso, was shot and killed during a carjacking in 1975. Matthew's mother last saw him on July 5, 1977, when she dropped him off at a rail station so he could get to a court appearance over a parking ticket. He called her a few hours later to let her know he would be going to Chicago to visit his sister at her apartment. He left his sister's apartment around 6 or 7 o'clock that night after telling her he was going home. He never arrived. John Mowry had also been impacted by homicide before he himself was murdered. In November of 1972, when he was just 14 years old, he had been sent to his sister Judy's apartment to check on her, only to find her stabbed to death on the floor. John joined the Marines after graduating high school, returning to Chicago after completing his service. He worked at a bank and began taking accounting classes at Truman College in Uptown. The last time his mother saw him was at her home, where he came for dinner in an effort to cheer himself up after one of his dogs was struck and killed by a car. 20-year-old Tommy Bowling was the married father of a 3-year-old boy named Timmy. Before disappearing on November 18, 1977, he called his parents' home to check in on his father, who had not been feeling well. Around this time, he had been receiving threatening phone calls, which he took seriously enough to instruct his mother to contact the police should she not hear from him for 24 hours. 16-year-old Robert Winch was one of 6 children from Michigan. His father taught physics at Kalamazoo College. Robert had difficulties at home, which led to him staying in a foster home during weekdays. He ran away from that foster home in November of 1977. Timothy O'Rourke was 20 years old when he vanished on June 30, 1978. He had a distinctive tattoo that read, Tim Lee on his left arm, a tribute to his love for martial artist Bruce Lee. He frequented gay bars and was close friends with a transgender woman, which Gacy's defense team later tried to use to undermine the witnesses, who spoke on his behalf at Gacy's trial. 20-year-old James Matsara of Elmwood Park was last seen by his family the day after Thanksgiving of 1978. He had the nickname of Mojo. 16-year-old Kenneth Parker's family lived in the Edgewater neighborhood after moving to Chicago from Tennessee. He was going through a difficult time and was on parole. He spent a lot of time hanging out at the Yankee Doodle Dandy, a restaurant in Midtown with his longtime friend Michael Marino. Michael Marino was just 14 years old. He and Kenneth Parker were last seen alive on October 24, 1976, at the Yankee Doodle Dandy. Their remains were later found in a shared grave beneath Gacy's house. His mother had reported him missing after he failed to arrive to see a movie with her as planned on the evening of October 24th. John Bukowich was later described as a nice kid who lived with his family on the north side of Chicago. He was close with his parents and sisters and had plenty of friends. He would always call home if he would be returning late. He had dropped out of high school to work in construction and worked for Gacy on and off for over a year. When he disappeared in July of 1975, he reportedly was trying to get Gacy to pay him back wages he still owed him. John's family always suspected that Gacy was involved in his disappearance and called police every week for more than 2 years, trying to get them to investigate his case seriously. Authorities insisted that John had simply run away. Circumstances did not support this theory. John had been working to renovate his first apartment and had just spent $2,000 on carpeting before he disappeared. He also left behind a large amount of money in his bank account. Also discrediting the runaway theory was the fact that his car was left behind in a location Gacy would later admit to moving it to. The keys were left in the ignition, and John's wallet, keys, and ID were on the front seat. These 24 of Gacy's victims were identified by March of 1980. In June of 1981, the 9 victims who had still not been identified were laid to rest in donated caskets. A short service for all 9 victims was held outside Abbey Chapel of the Oak Ridge Glen Oak Cemetery, and each victim also received his own graveside service when he was buried under a grave marker reading, "We remembered." Each victim was buried in a different cemetery. In May of 1986, one of these victims was identified as 16-year-old Timothy Jack McCoy, leaving authorities with 8 individuals to identify. Tim had small-town origins, but an extensive travel history, living in and visiting numerous states across the country during his short life. This was the result of both his father's restlessness, which brought the family to places like California and Florida, and his own. He was mischievous and daring from a young age, and was never afraid to throw himself into a lake or even a moving boxcar without hesitation. At 15, he left school and obtained a fake ID so that he could work as a forklift operator. Tim's life was largely formed by his large extended family. It made up a large part of the population of his hometown of Bartlett, Iowa, and he traveled regularly to spend time with the members of the family who had moved throughout the Midwest. He spent New Year's of 1972 visiting one of his cousins in Michigan. He left Michigan by bus to return to Omaha, where his father was living, on January 2nd. He had an overnight stop in Chicago during which he met Gacy at the Greyhound station. In October of 2011, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart announced a renewed effort to identify the remaining 8 victims. They were all exhumed so that samples could be taken for DNA testing, and Sheriff Dart made an appeal to the public, asking for friends and relatives of young men or teenage boys. He went missing any time between 1970 and December 22, 1978, to contact his office. The appeal quickly yielded results. The boy previously only identified as Gacy victim number 19 was identified as 19-year-old William George Bundy. On November 29, 2011, Bill's mother had feared he had been one of Gacy's victims and tried to get his dental records to submit to police as they had requested back in 1979. However, his dentist had retired, and by the time she was able to track him down, he had destroyed all of his records. Bill was identified after his brother and sister provided DNA samples. Bill had been popular at Senn High School and had plenty of friends. According to his sister Laura, all of her friends wanted to date him and only came to see her at her house for the opportunity to see her brother. He was a talented diver and gymnast. However, Bill ultimately chose to drop out of high school to begin doing electrical work. Bill went missing in October of 1976. One evening, he told his family he was headed out to a party as he was leaving the house. He forgot to take his wallet with him. He never came home. In July of 2017, victim number 24 was identified as 16-year-old Jimmy Hackinson. His mother had gone to Chicago from her home in Minnesota in 1979 to try to learn if her son was amongst Gacy's victims, but she did not have dental records to submit to the police to identify him. He was also identified thanks to DNA submitted by his brother and sister. Jimmy was one of 4 children and lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was funny and good-natured, despite difficult circumstances at home. His father drank heavily and was largely absent, and his mother often had to work as many as 3 jobs at a time to support the family. One day in the summer of 1976, he announced to his family that he was going to Chicago. Hitchhiking was not unusual at the time, and Jimmy had left home in the past. To get away from stressors at home, he had always safely returned, so this trip did not raise any concerns. He called his mother on August 5th to let her know that he had safely made it to Chicago. However, weeks then passed with no calls from Jimmy, and he did not return home, so he was reported missing at the beginning of September. The number of unidentified Gacy victims then dropped to 5 on October 25, 2021, when the man previously only known as Gacy victim number 5 was publicly identified as Francis Wayne Alexander. In addition to his extended family, Wayne is survived by his mother, 2 half-sisters, and 2 half-brothers. DNA extracted from one of victim number 5's molars had undergone 8 months of specialized testing and processing to prepare a profile suitable to be used with genetic genealogy. The Cook County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project for the genealogical research. Genealogists identified Wayne as a potential match and submitted his name to the sheriff's office. Investigators there used more traditional means of investigation to follow up on the lead, when they could not find any evidence of Wayne being alive after the time period when they believed victim number 5 was killed, which would have disproven the identification. They traveled to North Carolina to meet with his family. They collected DNA samples from Wayne's mother and brother, which confirmed that Wayne was Gacy victim number 5. Wayne was born in 1955. He grew up in North Carolina and lived in New York for a time. He got married while he was living there. He and his wife moved to Chicago in February of 1975, but the couple soon divorced after 3 months of marriage. His family never filed a missing persons report because, based on certain decisions that he had made, they believed he wanted to be left alone. While they loved him, they thought he no longer wanted anything to do with them when he stopped contacting them. Wayne supported himself by working at various bars and clubs in Chicago. Authorities do not know exactly how he and Gacy crossed paths, but Wayne lived and worked in an area where Gacy was known to look for victims. He lived near several other victims of Gacy, including William Bundy, who lived just blocks away from Wayne. Wayne would have been 21 or 22 years old when he was killed. The last official record of him was a traffic ticket issued to him on January 5, 1976. He was buried at Gacy's property under an individual whose death authorities have placed on March 15, 1977, indicating that Wayne was killed sometime during the window of time between receiving the traffic ticket and the death of the other victim. Financial records show that Wayne earned very little income in 1976, potentially indicating that he was killed earlier on in that window. When investigators returned to the Alexander family to confirm that Wayne was in fact Gacy victim number 5 on October 22, 2021, there were 5 generations of the family in the room to hear the news. Wayne's mother was the first parent to still be alive to be notified that their son had been identified as one of Gacy's victims since the renewed effort began in 2011. The family greatly appreciated the kindness the people of Cook County had showed Wayne, giving him a proper funeral and burial, even though they had not known his identity when they did so. As of November of 2022, 5 of Gacy's victims remain unidentified, but investigators still hope to one day identify all of them. Victim 10 is believed to have been between 17 and 21 years old, and between 5 feet 7 inches and 5 feet 11 inches tall. He had a well-healed fracture to his left clavicle. His time of death has been estimated to have been between March 15th and July 5th of 1977. Victim 13 is estimated to have been between 5 feet 11 inches and 6 feet 2 inches tall, between 17 and 22 years old. His hair was a dark enough brown that it would appear black. He was probably suffering from a severe toothache at the time of his death, which has been estimated to have been between August and October of 1976. Victim 21's remains were completely skeletonized by the time they were discovered, complicating the process of determining exact details about him. He was most likely between the ages of 15 and 27, between 5 feet 8 inches and 6 foot tall, based on the location where his remains were found, relative to other victims with known dates of death. It is believed he was killed sometime between June 13th and October 25th of 1976. Victim 26 is estimated to have been between 5 feet 2 inches and 5 feet 6 inches tall, and between 22 and 30 years of age. He was most likely murdered sometime between June 13th and August 6th. Victim 28 was killed sometime between early 1972 and the end of July of 1975. He was between 5 feet 8 inches and 5 feet 9 inches tall and 14 and 18 years old. He was found wearing a white metal band on his left ring finger. He had brown hair and may have previously broken his right upper arm. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the depths of unsolved mysteries. Cold cases not only challenge our understanding of the past, but also ignite our curiosity and determination for answers. Remember to subscribe to stay updated on our latest investigations. And if you have any information regarding the cases we've covered, don't hesitate to reach out. Together, we can shed light on the shadows of the past and bring closure to those who seek it. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never stop seeking the truth.